Welcome to Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. Our guest in this edition is Edward Saylor, an engineer on one of the 16 bombers that took part in the Doolittle Raid in April of 1942. It was the U.S. bombing of the Japanese mainland in response to the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Doolittle Raid is not considered to have had much tactical significance in the course of events in World War II, but the impact it had on morale, both among our service members and at home, is incalculable. A few years ago, Mr. Saylor joined us at the American Veterans Center Conference in Washington, D.C., and he began by telling us about how he grew up.
I was born and raised on a cattle ranch in Montana. I joined the service in 1939 looking for a job. I found one.
At that point, of course, World War II was underway in Asia. We were not involved yet.
Yeah.
And by
the person was just winding down, and there's not much in the way of jobs yet.
And when things were building up in Europe, 1939, the war in Europe started as well. So when you joined the service, did you believe you'd be going to war soon?
Not particularly. I was a country kid. I didn't know much about world politics. I was looking for a job, and I thought I knew what I wanted to do, and it worked out good for me.
Where were you when you heard about Pearl Harbor being attacked?
We'd been on maneuvers with the Army down south. We're flying back to Pendleton, Oregon, when we heard about Pearl Harbor.
And what was your reaction?
It took a little bit to really realize what was all going on. But yeah, I figured we were into it now.
It was only 4 months later, of course, that the raid over Tokyo happened. How soon were you recruited or asked to join that mission?
I think sometime in January, maybe February, we had been moved to Columbus, South Carolina, and that's where General Doolittle came to make up his crews.
And what experience did you have at that point, being an aircraft engineer, a bomber engineer?
I was a crew chief. I'd done all the maintenance on the aircraft. I was also a flight engineer. I flew everywhere with the airplane.
And when you became part of this mission, were you excited about it? Were you convinced it was unlikely to succeed at the time? What was your thought?
Of course, we didn't know any details that early. I volunteered because I'd be going with my airplane that had been taken care of, doing a job I was already trained for, probably the best offer I was going to get into the war, so I said, I'll go.
What was your impression of then Colonel Doolittle?
Well, he's kind of a hard guy to describe. You know, he's a world famous aviator already. As a person, he was just a straight arrow, regular guy, businesslike as necessary.
Did you have much interaction with him before the raid?
A little bit, yeah, now and then. He was around all the time. We're training.
One of the big challenges, of course, in addition to actually successfully attacking the mainland of Japan, was to be able to get bombers to take off from an aircraft carrier. How big of a challenge was that?
Well, it didn't happen all at once. We didn't know. I didn't know for some time we were going to be taking off from an aircraft carrier. At Eglinton Field, Florida, we done short field takeoffs, which could have meant anything. It didn't sound like carrier to me. Probably some sort of jungle area where the runways had to be short. Didn't think that much about it. Whether anybody knew we were preparing to take off from a carrier, I don't know. I never heard anybody say. I didn't have any idea. All through our training was fuel consumption, which indicated some long flights, getting the airplane full of as much gas as we could carry, which also meant a long flight. Short takeoffs and long flight, and that's about all of the reaction I had to the training.
As an engineer, did you have a specific role in helping to outfit the planes for this mission so they'd be lighter and ready in other ways?
Not specifically. General Doolittle made sure all those bases were well covered. And my part was just to make sure the airplane was ready.
And how close to the actual date of the raid did you find out what the mission was going to be?
Well, I think we left Frisco about the 1st or 2nd of April. 4 or 5 days later, we found out that we were going to be bombing Japan.
And what was your reaction then?
Wasn't what I had hoped for, but we thought, well, I guess that's what we're going to do.
It's been said that many considered this at the time to be a suicide mission. Was that how you saw it?
That came later. Initially, it was just that we were going to bomb Japan. Just how it was going to develop, I wasn't sure at that point. Of course, they loaded all 16 airplanes on the flight deck of the carrier and took up the whole flight deck. So I thought, being transported someplace too far to fly. And I held that thought for a couple of days. Then they had us move all the airplanes around. And now all 16 airplanes were on the back half of the flight deck. And that was a moment of truth. We knew, I even knew then we were going to be taking off from the carrier. Then came the word about Tokyo.
As this was about to happen, again, it's 4 months after Pearl Harbor, and in addition to Pearl Harbor, there had been other setbacks in the Pacific for the United States, to be sure. Morale was not great at home. What was it like in the Air Corps?
We just set about doing our business. Morale was okay. My morale was always all right. I didn't know much about what was going on in the civilian area. I did know that we were losing islands in the Pacific. We lost Philippines and a number of other islands, and we were losing. People say that the public thought we were losing the war. I never put it in those terms, but I was aware of the fact that things were not going well.
So we get to April 18th, 1942, and this was already a bold enough mission, but then you discovered that you needed to begin the mission sooner than expected, correct?
Yeah.
What was that like, to know that you had to take off and cover even more distance than you thought you had to?
Well, it had been called the worst possible scenario in our briefings, and that's the way it developed to be. It didn't turn out that way, but it was considered a pretty poor option. There was no good procedure at that point. Just do the best you can. Get off, drop your bombs, and hope for some way out of there. We pretty well thought we didn't have enough gas to go the distance. And that was the problem, so yeah, it didn't look very good at that point. So. but we just were going ahead and doing what we had to do.
You were in the 15th out of
Yeah.
16 planes,
Yeah.
and as the engineer on the plane, where were you seated? What was your position?
Well, the engineer moved back and forth in the airplane as situation required. I was in the back end on takeoff. We had a 100-gallon rubber tank in my way. We had to burn that gas before I could get back up front. So,
How many were on the plane? How many?
5.
5 crew members.
We had no navigator. I didn't really have a gunner. I don't think anybody had a real gunner. On some crews, the crew chief flight engineer was called the gunner. On my ship, we had the doctor on board, and he was called the gunner. Dr. White, who was the doctor for the entire organization. He had wanted to go on the mission. So while we're in Florida, he got himself checked out on the gun turret, which gave him an argument with the general to let him be on the airplane. So he was on the same ship I was.
But the challenges for a successful mission did not stop there. When we come back, Mr. Saylor explains what he was focused on in getting his plane ready to be part of the Doolittle Raid. I'm Greg Corombos. This is Veterans Chronicles. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. Our guest this week is the late Edward Saylor. He was an engineer on one of the bombers that took part in the Doolittle Raid in April 1942. He joined us at our annual American Veterans Center conference a number of years ago in Washington, D.C., and shared his history with us. When we left off, he and the other 79 members of the Doolittle Raid had just discovered that they would have to begin their mission sooner than expected, which added a whole layer of complications to successfully completing the mission. But that wasn't the only challenge Mr. Saylor was facing. As the engineer for the 15th of the 16 bombers, he also had a major challenge getting his plane ready to go.
I had to take the right engine off the airplane. Discovered the problem. The gears that ran all the accessories, the fuel pump, the magnetos, hydraulic pump, everything, were suspect. I found 2 keys that kept the gears in place in the oil sump of the engine. I had to take the engine off and take it apart and put those keys back in place. Turned out to be a pretty tricky operation. The engine weighed about 2,000 pounds. Navy had no equipment that was suitable to remove the engine. They rigged up a tripod with a chain hoist, and everything I took off of the engine, getting it ready to remove from the airplane. Every nut, bolt, airplane part had to go up inside the airplane. The wind was blowing across the deck. I was afraid to lay anything on the deck. It would go right overboard and I'd be in real trouble then. But as it happened, everything worked out and got the engine off, got it down to the lower deck and took the back half of it apart, put the keys back in and put it back together. General Doolittle had said, asked me if I could fix it. I wasn't sure, but I said probably. This is a job that I'd never done. We didn't go that deep into an engine at base level. It was a depot job. But I thought I had to give it a try, so I said probably. And the general said, well, do what you can. If you can't fix it, we'll have to push it overboard. So I got the job done. I didn't have any parts left over.
That's good.
That was a good sign. I said, all them nuts and bolts are in there somewhere. Hopefully they're in the right holes, but they're all in there somewhere. So engine ran great and performed great for the entire mission.
Terrific.
No test flights.
I was just about to ask. That's a lot of confidence that it would would work properly.
It ran great on the deck, and so I said, should be all right.
It was ready to go. Being in the 15th plane, you knew that the first 14 had taken off successfully. Did that calm the crew quite a bit?
Well, I suppose it did. Actually, we all took off from the same point on the deck. You couldn't taxi the airplane on a power run past the tower. Wingspan clearance was critical. So we all had to taxi up past the tower and all took off from the same spot. They 457 feet. Airplane done real well. So the carrier was doing about 25 or so knots. Had a headwind of about 30 miles an hour. Add to that the acceleration of the airplane, and we had so much lift that the airplane got off real well. Everybody was airborne at the end of 450 feet or all, except the one airplane that didn't have his flaps all the way down. He went off the end, but he came on around. He very nearly went into the water, but he made it.
How long was the flight?
I don't remember exactly. 8+ hours.
Was it fairly uneventful?
It may have been as much as 12 hours. Well,
I mean, before you got to Japan, of course.
For the most part, it was uneventful, but when we got to Japan, along the coast of Japan was the Japanese Navy, big ships, battleships. And we flew right over them. They ignored us. We were less than 1,500 feet altitude. We had came in low to escape any sort of radar they might have had operating. So we were quite low, flying over these battleships, and I thought they would be shooting at us. Kept waiting, didn't happen. We passed over a dozen or so Navy vessels, and they ignored us, and we found out later that they were not expecting us. So, and we did not fly in formation. Each airplane was by himself, so we didn't cause any particular reaction that way. It was planned that way, yeah. And it worked. It worked. But the interesting thing is why we weren't shot at or shot down. We surprised the Japanese. See, we were spotted out several hundred miles into the Pacific, and we intended to get within 400 miles of Tokyo to bomb and make it over to China. And when we were detected somewhere between 250 and 400 miles out too far, that mileage figure got bandied around a little bit, depending on, I think, who's telling the story. I was told we were 400 miles out too far. The common thought nowadays is 250 miles. In any case, we didn't have that much gas. So that was a problem. And when we were spotted, of course, the picket ship that spotted us, the Navy sank it. It had radioed Tokyo. They knew that there was a carrier out there heading their way. They thought, the Japanese thought they knew every airplane we had that could operate off a carrier, and that we would have to get within 200 miles of Tokyo to make it back to the carrier. They did not know we were never going back to the carrier. We had longer range airplanes. We were in bombers and not the Navy fighters that they were familiar with. They thought they had time to plan for us. And another thing that apparently interfered with their planning was their mindset that they couldn't be hit anyway. They never had been over history. So for those reasons, they thought they had time to plan for us. And meanwhile, we got in and out of there without too much trouble.
So the element of surprise, definitely a factor.
I thoroughly expected to get shot down, captured, whatever. And when it didn't happen, made me wonder what was going on. How come the battleships didn't fire at us? Anyway, the facts all came out later, and we surprised them.
So not one shot.
Well, we had some anti-aircraft fire over Kobe about the time and just after we were dropping our bombs.
How big was the payload?
2,000 pounds, 4 500-pounders. One of the 4 was a 500-pound cluster of incendiaries, 125 4-pound incendiaries.
Did you have specific targets?
Yeah, and we bombed factories along the waterfront. I'm not sure what all was being done in the factories. I know one was a shipbuilding concern of some size. I'm sure we hit our targets right on.
Could you see it from your low altitude?
Yeah, and you kind of looking over your shoulder and seeing the dust and everything back there, stuff blowing up.
At this point, how much fuel was left in the tank?
I don't know. Not quite enough.
So you were on your way to China, but
Yeah.
didn't quite get to the mainland.
Well, we continued I say we had some aircraft fire. As far as I know, we didn't get hit. It took me a few seconds to realize that those black puffs of smoke they were shooting at us. Anyway, and 2 fighter planes followed us for a ways, and then they decided to leave and broke off. And apparently never identified us. So the rest of the flight across the China Sea was pretty uneventful. We was cruising along. It was getting pretty late, starting to get dark. Seas were a little rough, and we had a headwind, and we didn't have much hope of making China at that point. You couldn't rely on your gas gauges 100%. They weren't not that accurate. We knew we were getting short of gas. We sighted some land, which turned out to be some islands. And we had to decide, we knew then that we were right at the coast or close to it. Had to decide what to do at that point. Very stormy, heavy clouds, gas gauges were basically on empty. To go on inland and gain enough altitude to bail out was one option. The other option was sit down in the water. We decided not to try to get inland because we didn't know when our engines were going to quit. We had to pull up to an altitude safe for bailouts because the area was sort of mountainous, pretty big hills. And we would not have known when we bailed out if we're over water, land, Japanese camp. It just didn't look very good, so we sat down in the water. And that worked out all right. Airplane done real well. It stayed on top of the water. It bounced along the waves, little waves, stayed level, floated for 8 or 10 minutes. It was quite buoyant because of all the empty fuel cells. Got our got out and got in a life raft, and we could see the silhouette of an island. But as we pushed off of the airplane, it went down nose first. When the flight control surface, the aileron, came by the life raft, snagged a hole in the life raft. We lost all the inflation in one half of the raft, so it was no longer a usable life raft. And to complicate matters for me, I didn't know how to swim. But there was a rope attached to the life raft, and I hung on to it, and it took me to shore about a half mile. I hung on to it all the way to shore.
And how were you rescued from there?
We never really got rescued. There was no rescue facilities anywhere in those days. This was a little island off the coast of China, inhabited by the Chinese fishermen and the Japanese soldiers. The soldiers would come in the daytime, loot and ransack the place, steal what they could find. And at night they would go out into a gunboat and go round and round the island all night. That was the situation there. We had to hide from them in the daytime and do our traveling at night when they went off the island. It's quite a long story. There's so many details involved. We've seen a light in the hut. We spent the rest of the night there on that shore. Early morning, seen this light in the hut, went over there and met Chinese fishermen. Tried to communicate. They took us in a little hut and we sat around, and somebody showed up with a book that had the flags of the world in it. Picked out our flag and they recognized us. So from that point, they figured we were all right. Up until then, I'm not sure what they were thinking, how much they knew about the war or Americans. But as soon as we established that we were Americans, we were in good hands.
How long were you there?
Well, they took us across this island, several hours hike. Another fisherman rowed us in his boat over to a second island. This was all at night because we watched the gunboats go around the island and we timed them so that we would know when to start heading for the other island. And that all worked out. And on the second island, we walked up the top of a tall hill to the Buddhist temple and hid in a cave all day. The minister in that temple took us in, and he was trying to figure out what to do with us. He had a tin can full of sticks about the size of a chopstick. He shook this tin can until 2 sticks fell out, had writing on the sticks. He read the sticks and decided what to do about us. There was a whole bunch of other sticks in a can. We're glad these 2 fell out because they were the right ones for us.
Oh my word.
And he decided, he took us into a room, slid back the wall. We went into a cave that was next door to the building and spent all afternoon in this cave while the Japanese soldiers came. And we watched through a crack in the top of the cave caused by the roots of a tree, watched the Japanese soldiers' feet going by, and they were yelling and trying to find us. They finally gave up after, I got 4 or 5 hours. And they left And the priest came and got us out of the cave and showed us how the soldiers had tracked us to that building. We had the only shoes of any of the people on that island whose shoes had heels. And they tracked us through our footprints right up to that building. And there were no footprints leaving the building. So they had good reason to believe we were in that building. And they spent 3 or 4 hours around outside the building, inside it. I kept waiting for them to tear the building down, but they didn't. They left, and everything worked out. We went on down the road. I found out this was still not the mainland. Another fishing boat rowed us to the mainland. We were stopped. This was in the middle of the night. We were stopped by bandits who frequented those waters. They would stop all the boats and do whatever they wanted. They stopped our boat. There were 5 of us lying in the bottom of this boat. The boat was about 20 foot long, wooden structure. We were laying under a tarp in the bottom of the boat. A decision made by the fisherman that was rowing the boat. He knew we might get stopped. Anyway, we were stopped by the bandits, and they never came on board our boat or lifted the tarp. We were that close. They finally left.
Retired U.S. Army Air Corps and eventually U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Edward Saylor, veteran of World War II and a veteran of the famed Doolittle Raid. I'm Greg Columbus. This is Veterans Chronicles. Hi, this is Greg Columbus, and thanks for listening to Veterans Chronicles, a presentation of the American Veterans Center. For more information, please visit AmericanVeteransCenter.org. You can also follow the American Veterans Center on Facebook, and on Twitter, we're at AVC Update. Subscribe to the American Veterans Center YouTube channel for full oral histories and special features. And of course, please subscribe to the Veterans Chronicles podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and please join us next time for Veterans Chronicles.